So, okay, we're back. We are recording again, so all this will be is recorded and will be posted online. And with that, I would like to share a few thoughts I had on that front. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Cool. Okay, so thoughts about client-side A/B testing, potentially without the client. So as we heard, client-side A/B testing is great. It enables non-developers to try out changes to the site without deploying code, without bugging developers, and it is completely decoupled from release cycles for their site's production code. At the same time, it can be often bad for performance. It can introduce render or parser blocking scripts. And in cases where it doesn't, it requires a bunch of anti-flicker snippets or result in user-visible site changes that can be jarring. And more often than not, it also results in significant JavaScript payloads to the site, which, as we heard, are often not cacheable because the A/B testing part is personalized, can vary per user, can vary per URL, and that payload has to be downloaded for each new page. So the question is, can we as an industry do better and find a better way to provide the benefits without the downsides? So the goals that I had in mind when thinking about this was, one, to enable code-free experimentation. So enable those experiments without having to actually modify the site's code. Performant delivery, obviously. So ideally, we want the HTML to be transformed before it reaches the client whenever possible. At the same time, we want caching to be we want better caching for this in order to reduce both download sizes as well as reduce server load. And we didn't really talk a whole lot about server-side A/B experimentation, but when experimenting with a lot of server-side, when running multiple server-side experiments, we're running a risk of exploding our the caching granularity and forcing our caches to essentially save a copy of the transformed HTML per experiment. Either we abandon caching altogether, or we have to cache many different HTML files for every single URL, which results in reduced hit rates. We also ideally would like the solution to be to provide us with CDN flexibility. Grishma touched on the edge side and CDN-based delivery of A/B testing, but those solutions, if they rely on a specific CDN, by definition, prevent people from moving from one CDN to the other, or provide multi-CDN solutions, and that essentially reduces adoption, because not everyone, not all sites that use a certain framework are on a certain CDN. And ideally, we would love a solution that works for all CDNs or no CDNs at all. And finally, a bonus is performance-oriented experimentation. Right now, there are many many front-end techniques and front-end ways to make your site more performant, but it's very hard to experiment with those using client-side A/B testing. Andy Davies wrote a post about running various performance-related experiments using a CDN and edge workers. But that is not something that currently like client-side A/B testing frameworks can give you because of the performance impact that will probably throw off whatever results you may get. Thinking about this, it seemed like there are two potential places where we could perform transformations before they reach the user. One is at the CDN's edge, and the other is before the HTML leaves the origins network, but ideally after it leaves the origins caches in order to prevent the caching issues that I talked about. So option number one would be to somehow figure out a way to run an experiment proxy on the origin network. That proxy would then get the HTML, download the JavaScript or whatever other means to communicate to it what transformations this HTML needs to go through, and then apply those transformations. There are many sub-options here. So theoretically, we could see where each framework implements, each A/B testing framework implements a proxy that does that for them and encourages their customers to install it. We could imagine a common code base for the proxy itself with multiple plugins for the various A/B testing frameworks, or we could imagine a common transformation language for multiple A/B testing providers that a single proxy implementation can then apply at the edge, or not at the edge, at the origin network, and but still, site providers will have to manage that proxy, which is the main downside here. Every site that we would want to adopt the solution will have to install and maintain that proxy. We have past experience, for example, with mod page speed that showed that this can result in low adoption rates. At the same time, this also has advantages. We need a low level of industry consensus in order to prove that this is workable. And it doesn't require the sites to be hosted on a CDN or be covered by CDN. The second option is for the CDNs to provide some sort of a transformation service where they could either provide an off-the-shelf per framework implementation for edge side transformations for that specific framework, or if we were to manage to reach some sort of a common transformation language, they could provide an off-the-shelf implementation for that transformation language that covers multiple frameworks. And here, the pros are that CDNs can facilitate, in a way, facilitate the installation and, in a way, share the installation cost across all the sites that will use that service. On the downside, this probably required a higher level of industry consensus, either among CDNs or among all CDNs and A/B testing providers. And it is likely to also carry some per site maintenance cost because, or the CDNs are likely to transfer their transformation costs to their customers, and that can also impact that decision. And because of that, each site will have to activate that solution on its own. There's no, it doesn't seem like a solution that CDNs can just turn on overnight and make the internet faster. It's somewhat of a slower adoption curve. Thinking about alternatives to that, mostly are mostly around what the browser can do to help frameworks today. So the browser can't really impact the delivery, but it can provide potentially better primitives. So one thing I thought about is what if we were to provide a render blocking but not parser blocking script loading primitive, so that instead of the synchronous script that is blocking the parser, as Tim showed earlier, we were able to just have a script that blocks the rendering, but enables the parsing to continue. I'm also, at least to me, it's unclear how the client-side HTML transformation actually happens. And because it seems like the script can deal with both a situation where the HTML is already there when it's running and a situation where the HTML is not yet there. Maybe we can provide better primitives for those scripts to perform those client-side HTML transformations. One thing that came up is implementing the network side solution, but as part of a service worker, which would have been a viable option if not for the first load issue, in which service workers don't work on first load, but maybe there's we can think of different primitives that would enable those client-side HTML transformations before the HTML reaches the parser or afterwards. And essentially, maybe there are other things that browsers can do that would be able to help us. And I think that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think that we can work towards solutions that cover both options. We can see what browsers can do to improve client-side. And I think that from what we saw from Grishma, even if we were to, even if we had those edge-side and server-side transformations, some transformations will always be on the client side because there's some information that only the client has and we don't want to send to the server. But we do want, or sites do want to modify their users' content based on that. So we will, essentially, I think we should work towards both of those very different solution spaces. And with that, let's brainstorm. And yeah, I put together a few questions here that we can discuss, but I also made the slides essentially anyone can comment on the slide. So please, if you have more questions you would like us to talk about, please add them as a comment, and I'll click them through. But maybe I can start off with a question to the AB providers. Is a future where there's a single transformation language that AB testing frameworks emit, and that can run either on the client side or on a generic server, either on the edge or the origin network? Is that something that you find feasible, appealing? Am I hallucinating, or is this something that can actually work, essentially?
So we actually had a hack project associated with that at Optimizely. This was specifically for CMS. So to have the advantages of a server-side testing, but have the advantage of a client-side testing, but the performance of server-side testing. So we created a language which CMSs can hook into and create their own implementation. But you still had the WYSIWYG editor, which would make all the changes. So I can see that as a plausibility for sure, but getting that option is going to be the biggest problem. And also, like, most of our customers may not be wanting to put in as much effort. Like 50% of our customers are probably very small. They don't have the manpower to do specific implementations.
I think that, sorry.
No, go ahead.
A standard language, I believe like that most of the tools are indeed, have a set of primitives that are equivalent, more or less. And if that language would be something that the browsers could, implement, then, at least that's something that would always work. And perhaps in many cases, it could be also done on the server side. I mean, there are situations like, single page apps, other cases where, you don't really have the content on the server, but maybe it's something that, could work across all these various ideas.
Okay. Ishan, you raised your hand.
Yeah, Ishan. So I was going to say something, actually, two things. One, which is very similar to what Dimitris just said. But for a common transformation language, you want it to work flexibly across like the client and the server and during the SPA lifecycle. We have a lot of clients who have helped with Edge A/B testing in the context of single page applications or Jamstack-like things. But in our case, our clients are IT dev team. And so it's a little easier for them to do some of the stuff here. And so I'm going through this and I'm hearing, we still also want a WYSIWYG. And having helped a bunch of clients do this, my intuition is that there's not going to be one solution that solves all the constraints we're outlining here. And it might be useful to try and prioritize which one is more important, or which are the most important, or what are the top three. Do we have to have WYSIWYG? Do we have to have, the ability to do behavior on behavior stuff? So that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Paul.
Yeah. Hey. So I wanted to comment on the part of your question of is this crazy? I don't think it is. This is what we've been doing for a couple of years now. I think it sort of goes back to this idea of there's a compromise. Either you get the ease of use, and that comes typically with a higher performance cost, or you really go for performance, and then you're typically a little bit more on the developer side of things. But this experiment that you're describing, we've done it. We still do it. It's the concept of a proxy. I do think that when you talk about how you manipulate the experience, given the landscape of how the client-side technology is, to me, it sounds really hard to rule out using client-side techniques to manipulate or create an experience that runs in a browser. I just don't see how you work around that. There's a part of how do you manipulate the experience before it gets to the browser. In our case, it sort of fundamentally regex on the source of the page before it gets to the browser. And so that unlocks things that, it's one thing to use JavaScript to manipulate an already constructed page. DOM is rendered, you're sort of on top of that applying a treatment. It's something else to be able to swap the JS before it gets to the page. And I think that's where there's a lot of gain that can be done in terms of performance while maintaining the ease of use of this language, both from a WYSIWYG and from a how do you empower the developers. I think there's a lot there. The friction we see is you're now talking to IT departments to get this thing in place, where the end user consumer is not necessarily on that team at all and is more on the marketing side. So yeah, not perfect, but just perspective on this.
Thank you. And just to clarify, you mentioned you're applying regex on the JavaScript before it's being parsed. Is that at the edge, at the origin, or in the browser somehow with weird hacks?
Yeah, so could be either or. So it's not necessarily applying regex on the JS. It's anything that's in the flow of traffic. Could be HTML, could be XML, could be JSON. Those are, other interesting scenarios for native apps and else. So it's either on-prem, which is, I think, the on-network slide you had, right? That's one model, and that's right after origin cache, apply transformation there. So that would be typically on the actual container. If you're talking SPA, that's the initial container, swap libraries or whatever else you need to put in that initial container so that you have all the logic in there when the page is ready to render for the rest of the experience client side. Or it's more of a, either it's a private cloud or public cloud, and you either interface directly with the CDN, but it's still this idea that you're modifying the source of the page to inject, modify, replace, not necessarily modifying the JS. I mean, the JS would be loaded on the container, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I know some people were saying like there's constraints with having a transformation language, like the everything being represented and across SPAs and so forth. And I agree, and I also wonder though if we couldn't take like an incremental approach, if there were just a few primitives supported at it, but it had an escape hatch for running, custom JavaScript effectively, just out of a matter of being pragmatic, for two different reasons. There are multiple sides of support you need here, right? On a given CMS, for example, also the A/B testing provider and the standards group to have implemented that given type of transformation. You also have customers who will insist on being able to kind of just paste in some CSS and some JavaScript, and taking that ability away from them will result in them not adopting this at all, I think. And so if we had like an escape hatch in such a transform language, it's like, here's some arbitrary CSS and arbitrary JavaScript that could be used to mitigate each of those different shortcomings in the meantime, but pointing them and steering them towards a happy path as we implement additional things. I think that would make it more palatable. It would also give us the opportunity to gather use cases for what transforms to support, which I think will not immediately be clear, especially with regards to SPAs and so forth. So that was it.
Yes. Thank you. In terms of browser side, like on the front of what can browsers do to help, do y'all have any ideas beyond what the two obvious options I wrote here? Like, is there something else that the browser can do to enable A/B testing frameworks to consume, like load faster, consume less CPU on the client, and minimize, ideally to zero, the cost? Is there, like, how does, maybe you can share a bit about like the current implementations and how they operate on not yet loaded, presumably the data was downloaded in the script. The script is blocking. The DOM is not yet there. So you need, are you registering mutation observers and finding when DOM nodes are added and then modifying them, or yes?
Yeah, that's typically how we do it. There's mutation observers, you register it, and you also mark it as already changed, so you don't reapply. So there's like a weird DOM manipulation that happens during that time, but it's mutation observers that we use mostly. Before that, it was polling.
It was what, sorry?
Polling for an element to be present every few milliseconds.
Okay.
I have a sort of question for Grishma. Actually, are there additional, to Yov's point about browser support, are there additional lifecycle hooks that the browser could provide that would allow some sort of like mechanical sympathy here, I guess, so that like the A/B testing snippet, which has quite a bit of CPU intensive code, could execute things at times that are more agreeable to the loading of the page? Like I know that we struggled a lot, with controlling like the sequence of execution of different things, like in JavaScript, right? Like sometimes, loading it in the head synchronously serves as something of a workaround for not being able to get it in exactly where we do need it, right?
Yeah. I think a few hooks for simple things would be like, I can think of tracking. For tracking itself, there could be a hook when it's not necessarily after everything is done. Because right now, most cases tracking is done asynchronously, but asynchronous means it can happen at a very critical moment, even without the browsers knowing. So like knowing when analytics is a pretty ever-present thing. So knowing when analytics can kick in and start its tracking without bothering anything else, that would be one thing. As far as
like just on that front, if we were, because I agree that async scripts is like, async scripts are not a good solution to the loading problem. But if you were to like either defer those scripts or even load them at a later point in time, but use the performance APIs and the buffered flag to give you what you need from the page, is that sufficient, or are there still missing pieces there?
I think like deferred would work, but deferred is probably too early for tracking even sometimes. Like it's not that critical that it needs to be done before the HTML is passed. So yeah, we could use something like the performance APIs, find out the long tasks are done. It doesn't seem like a clean way, especially for something that is present on every single web page. There should be a very clean parameter that says like this is analytics or something, and so the browser should know when to send all the analytics, and it shouldn't rely on how a specific customer implements it or a specific vendor implements it. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, thank you. That's useful.
I have a question for the browser folks that are here. Sorry, is there anyone else in line? I can't see all the hands.
Yeah, Dimitri's just
go ahead. I'll go after him.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Mike.
Sure. Thank you. We talked, I think probably a couple of years ago now, about like content addressable JavaScript, like inline snippets of code, etc. I was thinking to your point about like, in several of the discussions that are going on here in the chat about proxies and kind of doing like man-in-the-middle rewriting of the contents that's being sent. And there's like a compromised approach to that, sort of where the proxy injects the JavaScript that is necessary to do, especially in the case of like needing SPA support, right? Like you can't do the transforms yet necessarily to the page if it's not been server-side rendered. But a problem with that, obviously, is there's some sort of tipping point where putting it inline is worse than just having a script source tag that loads it from a CDN. I think that like balance is, at least to me, like very opaque, and I'm sure it varies in all sorts of conditions about when it's better or worse. But if it were cacheable somehow by some sort of like attribute in the script tag that you could identify it as the same sort of chunk of code, at least for the purposes of parsing and execution. Obviously, like the transfer, the bytes themselves couldn't be cached. I just wonder if there's more that could be done here, and it kind of goes back to the same points about the browser exposing or the browser taking into account hints that JavaScript content on the page provide about its role in the page and so forth.
Yeah, so there is currently a proposal called Web Shared Libraries that can help with content addressable content delivery, I guess. The main problem there that we haven't fully solved yet is the privacy implications of having that content addressable resource. So if a certain user has some libraries that can say various things about them, and even if it doesn't say anything specific, the collection of libraries that they already have in cache versus not can provide a good fingerprinting surface. We've been thinking about that in terms of, on the one hand, trimming the list of things that can be shared, and at the same time, aggressively prefetching those so that essentially all users will have them in their caches to some extent, but it's still not a trivial problem. At the same time, I hear you that it would definitely help reduce the download sizes here.
Thanks.
Dimitris?
Yeah, I want to just add here maybe that the idea of some sort of transformation language, if the browsers start implementing that, I'm kind of wondering, it was covered by a lot of people that the CMSs should have been playing a bigger role in the A/B experimentation story. I think I saw in some comments that it's very few of them that support it, and that obviously, I know it's a fragmented area, but I think the fact that there is not some sort of standard for a A/B tool to provide transformation instructions, or that could help on one hand. Yeah, and because here another totally different topic here, because you have the list of questions. What I think these tools are looking for help is this idea of persistence of experiment variants for users. Today, I think most tools are using cookies and local storage. I don't know if that's a good thing. I know, kind of raises questions about, consenting and everything there. I'm wondering if it makes sense for the browsers to help in that area. So we don't have to touch the site cookie space or even local storage for purposes of experimentation.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm not sure I have answers on that front, other than the fact that if you want an arbitrary number of bits as your variant ID, that is something that will end up looking an awfully lot like a cookie. But yeah, it's definitely something to think about. Chris, I see you next.
Hey there. I had two questions. So the first one is that we keep talking about a split between different responsibilities. Marketing needs to be able to implement something specific that they require with their own channel, and engineering resources need to be able to work independently. Is there a browser-based solution potentially that would can take advantage of the fact that these are different groups in many scenarios? So perhaps a side channel attached to the HTML document using the output of a mutation observer that applies changes as the document is streaming. This will allow the groups to work independently and not require client-side JavaScript to execute. And then the second thing is around what we're trying to solve. So we keep mixing concerns. We've got people trying to solve for single-page applications, people solving for multi-page applications, people solving for Jamstacks. These are very different scenarios, can we limit the solution space to solve for a smaller subset of this, and as a result gain 80% of the value with 20% of the effort? So perhaps maybe these solutions wouldn't tie into something like a single page app, which tends to need more knowledge about how the app is constructed in the framework. You could imagine a solution that understands how your React hooks work and injects some differential values, for instance. But that's pretty complex. Whereas the multi-page app solution would be more simple and potentially impact a very wide audience at a much faster clip. Those are my two things, kind of broad. Sorry for lots of info there.
No, it's very useful. Yeah, so regarding your first thought, it sounds awfully like the common transformation language implemented in the browser. Is that what you're...
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm going. The idea was to reduce the JS impact, and because it would be side-channeled through the main document request in a to-be-determined factor, this means that the browser could actually implement it on C side, rather than trying to execute arbitrary JavaScript during the render phase even.
Yeah, so the browser would block rendering on this transformation language variant to avoid flicker, but yeah, then the execution itself would be significantly faster than arbitrary JavaScript, and then arbitrary JavaScript can be added on top of that for things that cannot be accomplished with this. Yeah. Interesting, definitely.
Yeah,
interesting.
the other part of it I think that is important to note is that it uses an already established web proprietary technology, mutation observer output. Since this is not really a solution designed to target properties, only attributes.
Cool, thank you. Dimitris?
Yeah, I just wanted to reply back to Christopher about this. The thing though there about something that works only on the server side is that there is really like a big variety of ranges in client dynamic sites. SPS is the extreme, but I actually had done a lookup in a big sample of sites recently to see like what's the state there. And it was quite like shocking, like a very big percentage of the sites are changing their DOM in one way or another. It could be a social button that gets added. It could be, for instance, e-commerce, refining your cart thing. So there is a big range of client dynamic things. And the problem from the A/B tools perspective is that, I mean, you can't really tell the user, yes, you can change the header because that is on the server side, but yeah, no, you can't change this because it's actually, and sometimes the tools wouldn't even know how the content really came up there, right? You can imagine that an e-commerce refinement results list, that's something that happens with Ajax a lot. You have the title that also gets added every time, and then they wouldn't be able to change that thing, right?
So just as a response to that, the idea here was that transformation language is baked into the browser, right? And is actually being applied on mutations as well. So since we're opting in to say, I want the following changes using this DSL that is already baked into web specifications, then all changes that happen on that document follow that specific specification. There's probably problems with that, but it would be an interesting space to pursue because it would allow the browser to do the work, and it would be independent of the backend technical implementation.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
Cool. Dave?
I think it might be useful to describe how this proposed transformation language differs from CSS, which isn't to say that maybe it isn't CSS, but if it isn't, then why we wouldn't want to shoehorn this into CSS, because we're already doing things like media queries and responsive design. which is very similar to, I think, the kind of transformations we'd be doing for A/B testing. I don't know if people have thoughts on that.
I'm curious, and this is probably ignorance, but I don't recall a way for CSS to be able to change the attribute of, say, a custom element. And that's the kind of thing that I see pretty frequently in the experimentation that runs across our document basis of about 150 billion documents.
I mean, I think if there are elements that are either hidden or shown based on which cohort the user is in, I mean, you could do that right now with CSS classes and some JavaScript. So if we had some sort of like cohort attribute that could be based on, you know, some identifier stored in a cookie or passed as a header or local storage or something along those lines, then the browser, you'd still have to send out all of the elements, but the browser could choose which ones they were going to display the same way it does like a media query, but just based on the value of a cookie or whatever.
Yeah, so it might be worthwhile to hear from the A/B testing folks, but I think that DOM transformations are key to what people are trying to do, and that is not necessarily a capability you want to give CSS. At least it seems to me that that's the case.
I think I echo that. CSS, I would say, would cover some of the use cases, you know, around look and feel, styling, what it's designed for. But when you get into functionality, I think I agree. That's where right now the solutions tend to go with DOM manipulation when you get to functionality.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's not possible to add a new button somewhere with just CSS, right? That's not really possible. Like, if you wanted to add a new banner with some text on it, like, I mean, yeah, well, maybe you can use it before, but then what if you wanted the style, like you want to have an image in there, you really can't do that with just pure CSS. If you had an XSLT, maybe you could do that. But then if you have an XSLT, that's like a, you know, the transformation language we're talking about here. I have to kind of drop off because I have a medical appointment at 2. But one thing I wanted to add is that it seems though that like in addition to this transformation thing, one thing that we might be missing is the async script that delays initial painting. It like the fact that like these scripts are doing this thing where like, oh, like I don't want to be sync because it will block the parsing, so we want to be async, but then we don't want to paint it. Like, why are they doing it manually? Like, seems like that's one API we could add to the platform without, you know, because then the browser could decide, okay, the script's taking too long, so let's just not wait for the script and just display the content, right? In the case script failed to load, like one of the examples shown of like page complete being broken to the user because the script, you know, was taking too long to load or like never loaded.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I think that the only thing is that I don't think that async is the right primitive. I think we want to script, like we want to define predictable execution points rather than async, which is racy by definition. But I 100% agree that the fact that people nowadays resort to blocking scripts is a failure that seems not super hard to correct.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying async is the right semantics. So I'm just saying we need a sound print that's more async than sync, but still like delays the painting. And I guess the defer, somebody was saying that for tracking defer is too early or something like that. So maybe we need to think about, you know, what the exact time, like right timing for that type of script is. Anyways, I have to get out. Yeah.
Thank you, and I 100% agree. Okay. Where are we on the queue? It seems like the queue is now empty. So yeah, it sounds like we concluded to revive XSLT. Is that it? Yeah. No, but I'm, yeah. Yeah, I would love to develop the idea of a transformation language further. Chris, you mentioned mutation observer output. Is that currently a thing that I'm not aware of, or is that?
It's the way that the tool that we use works. So we output what the mutation is from a WYSIWYG-like editor, and then apply the mutation observers, apply the results of the mutation observer on the client. I think there is an interesting path there, just because it is something that already exists in the web platform. I don't know if it's necessarily the right one as a transformation language. It's super chatty.
Yeah, it would definitely be interesting to, yeah, to study, like do some sort of a case study on that bit. Is that part of, like you're saying, it's a tool we're using? Is that part of the AMP project? Is that something else?
Yeah. The AMP project can use this from any of the AMP caches as part of its experimentation framework.
Okay, and that tool is an open source one?
It is one that was under development for a long time, and then I don't know what happened, if it finished or not, but I do know it's in use by some people.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
There are a few comments on the chat. So there's this idea that maybe when you have a blocking script that is like all things being considered optional, like an AB solution or even like fonts. Fonts is like style sheets and then fonts. I think it would be useful to have a way, maybe for the developer or for the service provider, to say, this thing is not supposed to take more than XXX milliseconds. If it goes over that, it's probably a better idea to just give up and pretend this doesn't like exist at all. So I don't know if it's interesting, but that's something that we could explore maybe offline, if that's something that people will want to use.
Yeah, it certainly seems like an interesting primitive to have. So yeah, I have thoughts on script loading that are not super baked, but it seems like we want to define, at least in my view, we want to define points in time instead of like what developers need to do today is to say how is the script supposed to be loading? Is that a blocking script or an async script or the first script where blocking and async are suboptimal and defer gives you a single point in time? And I think what we need is more of a more options for the defer semantics. So where people can tell the browser, we want this script to run to block rendering, but still, but not block parsing. We want this script to execute after the first load, after the first paint. We want this script to execute when defer is now. We want this script to execute after onload when, on idle time because it's not super important. But essentially move from what semantics to when semantics, and give people more control over the when, and then browsers can have more flexibility as to how they're loading those scripts and when they're loading those scripts in order for them to be ready when the developers tells the browser that it needs to be ready. But yeah, I think it's it's a somewhat tangent to the, or yeah, having that will also enable us to have script loading that enables A/B testing loading as a render blocking async, and potentially with the timeout on the render blocking part. But yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about that I need to develop further. Yeah, Chris?
I think there was one, sorry, raising and lowering my hand. I think there was one other part about this that was not really covered through this approach, which is the actual signal of what variants to put a person in when they're visiting a page. It sounded like from the Optimizely and Google Optimize approach that was done also through the script. So if something was coming directly in the HTML payload, it would need to include that information so that the browser can make the right decision, or potentially the additional payloads are only for one specific variant at a time. I'm just not sure how that works in those systems, but I think we'd probably need to document that as we're looking at potential web platform solutions.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So you're talking about client-side variants or server-side variants?
Mostly the client-side variants. So there was a script that is loaded that is doing DOM mutation for the group or bucketing of the user. Is that how does if the browser takes over that work and does it in some way? Does it receive some kind of standardized information about what bucket a person belongs to for that visit and what duration? Like how would that be articulated to the individual session?
Yeah. So presumably it will, yeah. So I'm guessing, and like A/B testing providers can correct me, but I'm guessing it's a lot of that is cookie based, and then Grishma mentioned a bunch of decisions that are taken on the client that are not available on the server. Is that correct?
So I think it's not the targeting is done cookie based, but the decisions themselves, which are tracked, are usually done using JavaScript. And I suspect that would still remain JavaScript. From what I understood, the transformation language would purely be the changes applied. Like if JavaScript is asking change the color of this element to red, that's the part that the transformation language will be doing. But the fact that this was the change that was applied would still be in the control of the client A/B testing vendors, if I understood it right. So it would still require some JavaScript for tracking purposes.
So, yeah. So the goal here is not necessarily to eliminate JavaScript altogether, but to limit it to things that cannot be done. Like, essentially, ideally, eliminate the HTML transformation bit from script and delegate that to a separate DSL. But the point that Chris raised, which is a valid one, if we need potentially we need client-side code to decide which of the transformations should be applied. So potentially we could define buckets in the transformation language. So for bucket 1, these are the transformations applied. For bucket 2, these are the transformations applied. For bucket N, etc. And then the client-side JavaScript will just have to say which bucket was picked. If that, it would still make the JavaScript a blocking factor, but we'd need significantly less script for that. And this will only be something that will block decisions that have to happen on the client side that cannot happen on the server.
Yeah. So though I would say that is not significantly less code because it's the evaluation logic that takes most of the time. Typically on a specific page, a customer has maximum 5 experiments. Whereas for a specific project that the customer defines, they can have any number. So like the application of changes while slow is not the biggest factor. That is like when I pointed out some numbers on Edge that we see. So the changes applied part is the only thing that's sent to the Edge, and that part takes on an average 5 milliseconds. Whereas previously it was taking on an average 200, I forget, was it 150 milliseconds? Because the evaluation logic was the part that was taking the longer time. That is specific to Optimizely implementation. It can be optimized based on different factors, but that's still a significant portion of the synchronous JavaScript.
Can you clarify what you mean by evaluation logic?
So evaluation logic could be, so say a visitor comes from www.google.com. So the evaluation logic figures out which URL the visitor is coming from, how many experiments are defined for this, and how many experiments are valid for this particular visitor based on the URL, based on IP, whatever else the customer decides to define. And if the experiment is valid, which variation does the visitor fall into? So that's what I call as the evaluation logic. And then once you define that, you say, apply this logic.
Okay, and so that is the part that in your experience is consuming the most of resources on the client, and that is something that won't change in this particular like with a transformation language scenario. And is there a way to delegate that logic to the serving infrastructure? So make the decision, like assuming you don't need, you had the list of client-side only criteria, but if people don't use them, is there a way to delegate all that evaluation logic to the server and decide on the variant at serving time rather than on the client?
So like Performance Edge, the solution that we have kind of does it on the server side, even though it's a client-side. So that's one way. Purely server side has the negatives of like not being WYSIWYG, not having the capability, and you have to wait for code deploy.
Yeah.
So like Performance Edge falls under the best criteria of that. Obviously, it lacks certain attributes like local storage, which is used for behavioral, and we have decided not to support it.
Do you know and or can share how much pushback? So essentially, I think what we're describing here is something you already implemented in your Performance Edge, or so. How much pushback have you had from customers for not supporting the client-only evaluation logic in those scenarios?
So like we hadn't supported SPA features, which is basically URL changes and DOM present kind of conditions for a while. And that had a lot of pushback. So we had to add support to it, and that's done asynchronously. Since then, the major pushback is with respect to security, which is always a concern with A/B testing software, I feel. And also, like, we don't support PCI currently on Edge. So we have pushback against that. Other features, essentially, not a whole lot, because any customer who cares about performance is willing to make that change. So we also suggest that on the landing page, they implement Performance Edge, and on their subsequent, like deeper article pages and those kind of pages, they do the traditional optimizely, so they get the best of both worlds.
Okay.
Most people have been, most of our customers have been pretty receptive, but also we do charge for it, so not all the customers are right now ready for it.
Yeah, but essentially, if like what I'm hearing is that when you present like, or at the very least, the customers that are biased towards using that solution are willing to pay the loss of personalization price in order to get better performance. And yeah, okay. So that's encouraging. Thank you. Cool. Anything else? Because I think we added a bunch of interesting ideas to the slide. So thanks all.
Andy was raising his hand.
Oh, okay. I missed that. Andy.
So one thing I think, going back to Melissa's presentation in the beginning, we talked about the business people and this whole equation, and they're the people creating these experiments. But we need to persuade testing providers to expose data about what the impact of their tests are at runtime to those business people, either through GA or the run product they got, so they know some of what the decisions or what actions they're taking, what impact that's having on their visitor. Because at the moment, you look at an anti-flicker snippet and it runs, and how long the screen was blank for is never recorded anywhere unless somebody puts in a bunch of work to instrument it manually. So there are things like that where we can get providers to help people make more informed decisions. I think the other thing is people are doing edge-based A/B testing at the moment. There are people like, I think it's Love Holidays, who did a talk at Fastly's conference about how they were using edge workers to do A/B testing, and there's people doing it on Akamai as well. And it'd just be interesting to understand how they're getting on and what restrictions they're finding from that approach.
Yeah. So if I try to summarize your first point, it's essentially we need to surface the implications of A/B testing decisions to the people who make those decisions.
Yeah.
That sounds reasonable. At the same time, I think it's hard to do in today's infrastructure where it's, I think, hard to test without test and gather data without the A/B testing infrastructure at all.
Yes. So what I've done for a client recently is we've actually instrumented their A/B testing framework to understand how long people are seeing blank pages, or we've instrumented around it using mutation observers, because they had no idea they were having customers who were seeing a blank page for 3 seconds when they were navigating from one page to another. You know, if they've got that data, they make different decisions.
I'm wondering if there could be an agreement for instance, like A/B vendors to agree to have user timing that explain what's happening. Because like standardizing like those moments could help the tooling like surface the data and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
There are other verticals like that where standardizing on like user timing could help. Would that be appealing, or are there reasons why this won't work? I don't know.
I agree that it would be super interesting to surface some, convention that run providers, dev tools, the web page test can expose on that front.
Yeah, because maybe Adi can chime in if he wants, but I believe that Lighthouse is trying to do some of that, but it's like very kind of like manually crafted for a specific solution, and maybe sometimes doesn't really work. And so that would be better if we had like a common language.
Another thing that was touched on a little bit earlier was the limitations of like largest or first contentful paint and largest contentful paint when using it in like the flashing scenario. And maybe we could take that back to the working group and try to see if we can evolve those metrics a little bit to help us out, help run providers which are already capturing these metrics out in those kind of cases to better reflect the user experience.
Yeah, so essentially, if we have a first paint followed by a paint that turns everything into a blank page, and then another paint, then maybe the first paint should be the third one. That's complex yet interesting. Yeah.
Nicholas mentioned something in chat that he's already changed this already, so maybe it's already fixed.
Cool. Michael?
All right, Yoav, I sensed that you were beginning to wrap up there, and I suspect you were going to thank everyone, but I figured that risks not thanking you for organizing today and for all the great speakers and the presentations, and the amazing chat between everyone. I mean, I learned more today than I think I knew on this topic, so this was an excellent use of time. I quite enjoyed it. So thank you for organizing, and thanks for everyone. And I'll let you do the rest of the thanks, but I didn't want to skip over you, and I wanted to preempt you.
Thank you. Yeah. Ishan?
Yeah, one thing that occurs to me in terms of where browser standards could help, in the realm of edge-based A/B testing, and you want to preserve caching, the common mechanism that the server side will indicate stuff is through a cookie. But there's no good standard that I'm aware of. You can't say HTTP vary cookie to tell the edge on how to cache specifically for a specific sub-cookie within the entire cookie string. And that would make that type of splitting a lot more plausible, and the ability to have better cache hit rates would be a lot more achievable in this kind of edge experimentation. And that's something our customers I know have taken use of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so it wouldn't change much from an information exposure perspective, but it would make caching and edge and server side handling significantly easier. There was the key proposal from Mark Nottingham for a while that would have enabled to do that over cookies, but yeah, that's no longer a thing. So that's a good point. Thank you. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I was, as Michael said, I was, starting to wrap up just because I sense that there's, the number of questions starts to dwindle down. But if anyone has any, we have 5 more minutes theoretically. So if anyone has any other questions or things they want to bring up.
Maybe, I guess we'll go over the chat and the video to make sure that we captured everything. But this slide, is there anything missing? I think there was discussion about holding the first paint, ideally on a per element basis. Maybe that's something we could explore.
So I'll add that. So if I understand correctly, the suggestion was first paint, which ignores blank paints in between. If I understood Nick's suggestion correctly, you're saying something slightly different.
I think the idea is, like, obviously, rough idea would be to have a way in JavaScript to say, I'm about to paint something, but I don't want you because I know this is going to change, or there are like a few more things to get in place first. And doing that per element would be nice, because if you know that element X, Y, Z might be impacted by an experiment, you would just like retain the first paint on those.
Oh,
right.
So avoid painting specific elements that you know will be impacted by experimentation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So I think that yes, we will like. There was, I think, a parallel track in the chat that was super interesting. I tried to keep up with it, but haven't necessarily succeeded. At the same time, I copied everything to the agenda document, and Nick has been taking minutes throughout the whole thing. So thank you, Nick. And I believe the plan is to, like, my plan is to go over both the recording, the minutes, and the chat, and somehow curate them into concrete conclusions, and then publish them to the working group mailing list. I think that the discussion was extremely useful. I think that my conclusions are that as a format, it seems to be working. Like I think that despite the fact that we weren't all in a single room, we had a great discussion and put together a lot. Yeah, a ton of new ideas that will enable us to potentially make progress here. So I'm excited about that. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone, because the discussion was really great, and none of that would have been possible without y'all. So thank you. And yeah, so I will send, I know that not all of you, one final note, I know that not all of you are working group members. I'm hoping that some of you can become ones if that's at all of interest to work on this, like on the solution in this space. If it's of interest to you, feel free to reach out to me or Nick, and we'll discuss that. Cool. So with that, thanks everyone, and I will send the summary and see you all around.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.